Well, welcome to this module. This week we'll be talking about things that impact student mindset when they're making their college decision. In this particular video, we're going to address the idea of college rankings. U.S. News & World Report, Forbes, a lot of different entities rank colleges that students and parents use when making their decisions. To that end, I've asked Dr. Phil Schubert, who is the president of Abilene Christian University, to come in and speak on this topic. I'll be asking him some questions and he'll be giving some responses that will help us understand this topic a little more. He did his dissertation on the topic as he was getting his advanced degree, and I consider him an expert on the topic. Enjoy. You've done quite a bit of research on this topic, and I consider you an expert on this. So would you kind of walk us through some of the research you've done, what your dissertation was on, and what you've learned from your studies?
Sure. The college ranking subject has been the focus of a host of conversations over the decades in higher ed in terms of whether they're valid. Do they truly measure something that is appropriate as a gauge of quality for higher ed? Is it more than a beauty contest, which some would argue with or for? So there's a lot to look at in terms of the rankings. I think there's quite a bit of research that does suggest that whether you believe the rankings measure things that are important and matter, people do look at them. And they are influential, especially in the minds of parents and students as they go through the college selection process. The bulk of my research really looked at what was correlated with a change in an institution's ranking over time. So I obviously have spent a lot of time looking at the components of the rankings and what goes into the derivation of the ranking itself. But where the bulk of my research focused was on looking at studying institutions who had actually experienced a change in their ranking over about a 10-year period, and then looking further into that to see what factors were most closely correlated to that change.
So tell us how the rankings are compiled. What goes into an entity like U.S. News in compiling their rankings for publication?
So there are several major areas, 4 to 5 major areas. The first one is the one most often talked about. It's called the peer reputation score. And it's nothing more than a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being a marginal institution, 5 being an outstanding institution, and presidents, provosts, and chief enrollment officers across the country are sent an annual survey with a list of all the schools in their region, and they're asked to go and perform an evaluation, give them a 1 or a 5 or something in between. That's worth 25% of the overall ranking, which obviously means it's very significant, and many would say it's nothing more than a beauty contest is where some of that term comes from. Second area is an area called faculty resources, which is another major component worth 25%. It pulls in a whole host of factors, such as the number of classes that are offered with an enrollment of 50 or more, the number of classes offered with an enrollment of 20 or fewer, the average faculty salary, student to faculty ratio, percent of faculty who hold terminal degrees. So this is another significant area that has a major impact on the rankings, very different than the assessment of is this school a 1 or a 5, so it's much more quantitatively based. The third area is an area really focused on student outcomes, and it's really looking at retention graduation rates. And so it's getting to the question of, is the institution performing its duty to get students through school and graduated. Rankings also look at an area called student selectivity, which focuses on the quality of the student body, looking primarily at average SAT scores and high school standing of the student body to get a sense of what is the caliber of the student body on this particular campus. Then finally, there are 2 other factors. One looks at the amount of money that the institution spends per student. And they reward institutions for spending more. So the more you spend per student, the higher or the stronger your ranking will be. Now, it's not a terribly influential factor, but it's interesting to me that obviously that encourages an efficiency. There's not a reward for being able to do a better job, a more efficient job in a higher quality learning environment. And then the final piece is alumni giving rate. So they're looking to what extent do the alumni of this institution support its mission and feel good about the experience that they had.
Right. So I want to follow up on a couple pieces of that. The first on the alumni giving rate, you could have a ton of alumni giving $1, and it would count toward your alumni giving rate, and it doesn't matter what the amount is for that. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. They're looking merely at participation.
Okay.
Yeah.
And second, on the financial piece, they don't look at necessarily financial health. They're looking at like how much you're spending per student, correct?
That's correct. They really are looking at the raw dollar expenditure of the institution divided by the number of students. So how much are you spending per student? The sense being, the more you spend, the more the students are getting. So the more services and opportunities that you're providing in their educational experience. Now, you mentioned financial health, and I have to throw in part of my research was focused on, can you correlate an improved or diminishing ranking with institutional health? Meaning, if you observe an institution, and my research was looking at the institutional profile of about 300 institutions over a 10-year period and charting the course of their rankings. Did it go up? Did it go down? Did it stay the same? And was there some correlation to overall measures of institutional health? Meaning, if an institution's ranking improved, does that mean they were more healthy? And I concluded that that is indeed the case, that when you typically see institutions and experienced institutions who have improved or strengthened their ranking, that you can also correlate that with institutional health. I looked at about 30 different variables, everything from the number of applications for admission, to their enrollment, to the quality of their student body, to retention, graduation rates, faculty salaries, how much they were spending, et cetera, and began to discern that yes, in many cases, an improved ranking can be highly correlated with improved institutional health based at least on the metrics I chose to track, which I think is useful in one sense to institutional officials who can consider the rankings to be some level of an aggregator even for internal consumption, to say we might see that as we improve our ranking, because of what the components are to that ranking, it also indicates a stronger institution.
What do you think, in your opinion, what do you think the purpose is behind these rankings? Why do these exist?
I think it's like a lot of other things where consumers, and I think our students and families when they're going through this college selection process are consumers, and it happens to be one of the most significant purchasing choices that they make in a lifetime. But they desire to have help in discerning in a very complex market what kind of factors they need to be looking at, and to have something that will help them delineate one institution from another. And so, you know, as has been discussed in a lot of the literature over the years, sometimes determining to what extent a particular college or university is effective in educating students is sometimes difficult. Sometimes it's difficult for us internally to have precise measures of whether or not we're achieving the educational outcomes that we desire for our students. And so I think one of the things you see in the rankings is you see the opportunity for parents and students to have a quick aggregator, if you will, of all the factors that somebody who is smart deems to be important, and you put them all into a nice box and you say, here's how they stack up. And so that's pretty helpful because it simplifies the process for students and parents and gives them some peace of mind in what may be otherwise a very complex scenario.
Okay. So, you know, your schools report data to U.S. News and World Report or Forbes or whoever. Do you believe, or I would say, in your opinion, do you think schools accurately report their data to U.S. News and World Report, and then kind of explain why you would not agree with that statement?
That's a great question. Certainly there have been news reports over the years of institutions that have been found out to have been fudging on the numbers or manipulating the numbers. I don't think that is very prevalent. Okay. The primary reason I don't is because there's so many sources for official information, and even a lot of the U.S. News information comes from other sources such as IPEDS reports and other things that are tied pretty closely to government funding or accreditation, other standards that I believe most institutions are very thoughtful and have pretty standardized processes for ensuring that they collect accurate information report. I think certainly what's probably more likely than intentional misstatements would be just errors. And I think over time those correct themselves as errors are discovered and better efforts are put in place to ensure accurate data is collected. I think what's also a common occurrence too is institutional leaders in positions to manage and report data become aware of some of the factors. So I mentioned a minute ago, class sizes. I think what's more likely is an institution understands that class sizes of 50 or more and class sizes of 20 or fewer are part of what goes into the input of rankings. And so they actually manage to some of those metrics that they know U.S. News and other outlets will be looking at. But I don't think there's a prevalent misstatement of the data.
That's fantastic. So, okay, so we've seen, U.S. News and World Report's been around for a while. We've seen Forbes kind of jump into the game. Where do you see college rankings heading in the future? Do you think new entities will come in? Do you think they'll change the way they compile them? Do you think new factors will be put in? Just kind of tell me what your vision is of where college rankings are heading in the future.
My guess is that we won't see, it's just a guess, any radical shift in the kind of rankings or the way in which they're used or even the way in which they're derived. There was an article just yesterday that was discussing Robert Morse, who's the ranking guru at U.S. News, was on the record as saying there were some changes to this year's rankings, which are fixing to come out. And he went on to explain, but there are things like instead of the peer reputation being worth 25%, it was going to be worth 22.5%. And they were going to increase the importance of SAT scores and graduation rates. And they were going to highlight, to a lesser degree, the importance of high school standing in terms of graduation, what percent of the class graduated in the top 25%, in favor of a heavier weight on SAT scores. So, but those shifts are, fairly minimal, and it won't certainly change the underlying structure of the rankings, the collective components of what they measure, and I don't think it will significantly change how they're perceived or interpreted in the market. So will there be others who choose to enter the rankings arena with maybe a little different spin or some ulterior angle that they believe is more beneficial to consumers and parents, students and parents? I doubt it. There are several out there already that perform some level of an assessment of whether this is a good institution or A is better than B. And I would guess that there's probably enough of that out there for the market to be satisfied as opposed to pulling others into the game.
Okay, great. Okay, so finally, if you were standing in front of a group of enrollment professionals, how would you advise them to utilize college rankings in their sales techniques, in their marketing, in their recruiting of students and parents?
Yeah, I think if you discount the peer reputation aspect, which clearly that's such a subjective factor that it's hard to place a lot of confidence in the perception. Although, I think if you look at the schools who have higher peer reputation scores, you'll see that there's a reason that they do. So let's put that aside for a minute. I believe personally that the rest of what the rankings measure, if you look at the inputs specifically, and you look at the weighting that they provide to those inputs and how it influences the overall ranking, I think it's a fairly good aggregator of the things that should matter. There's been a lot of research done. My research included some focus on this in terms of what metrics have the most impact. And if you take 6-year graduation rate, freshman to sophomore retention, and you bring in SAT score of the entering class, which are all very closely related to one another, and you look at the impact that that has, it is a significant influence. If you combine those three metrics with the peer reputation score, you can pretty well predict ranking, even leaving everything else that they measure out. So then you have to step back and say, well, is it important to look at graduation and retention rates? Absolutely. Is the quality of the students that you're going to be around in your educational experience or with in a classroom, is that important? Absolutely. So I think there is a lot of merit to what the rankings look at and ultimately measure. And I think for higher education institutions, the focus on getting students through school and graduated, which ought to be one of the core competencies of what we do, because that's so influential, it gives me some comfort and confidence in saying, you know what, this isn't all bad. There's some really valuable things we can take from the rankings, and the schools that tend to perform better are schools who are doing a better job of educating students and graduating them and putting them in a situation around other students who offer the opportunity to spur their intellectual growth. And so I think it's a fairly good indicator of the contour of the market of higher education.
Okay, well, thank you for your time. I think this has been very valuable for our students. Thanks.
Great, thanks.